Speranza was the first to get it as they approached the steep. Kirby still rolling, others crawling, Kasten standing. "I'm hit," Speranza yelled and screamed like a panther. 3 bullets, 1 in each leg and 1 in the head. But marvelously, he still lived, and now he was erect and walking. Kasten, the reporter, yelled back, "Hell, everybody's hit." That was news to the others. Kasten had taken a bullet in one arm and several grenade frags in the back, saying nothing. In his last moments, the correspondent had the courage of a lion. Here was a man, and they knew it. Spikes yelled, "I'm hit." It was a bullet through the right arm. They then moved 20 feet down the rock bank when Speranza yelled again, "Hold it up. They're in front of us." Expecting it would come, Kirby froze right where he was. Kasten kept moving in long strides, straight to the trail, which led downhill through the elephant grass. He had made up his mind, and Kirby did not bother to shout a warning. Standing clear on the trail was an enemy soldier, rifle aimed. Kirby heard a scream as Kasten went down. Though Kasten was not 15 yards from him, he could not see the fall as the body was enveloped by the sea of grass. He heard the whack of the bullet and the thump of the body. The bullet had drilled Kasten through his left temple. Kasten's personal effects were looted as soon after he fell. The camera, films, and purse were later recovered from the bodies of the enemy in the fight that soon followed. Many of the next of kin get not even that grain of comfort. It is an agonizing matter for the commanders, having to explain why the dead soldiers' most prized possessions and pictures cannot be returned. Kirby could now hear enemy soldiers moving up slope toward him. Their chattering, the clang of metal from their weapons being worked. He was down on his haunches, and so were Speranza, Spikes, and Taste. None was firing. Their only thought was to hide in the grass, which rose 2 feet taller than a standing man. They all knew Taste was slowly dying. 2 bullets in his neck, multiple mortar shards in his back. Though conscious, he made no complaint, only asking for water, of which there was none. The skirmishers were moving up now and beating the grass on both sides of them. Kirby saw 7 of them coming right toward him, not 10 feet away, and he knew he was discovered. He still held an M79 grenade launcher. So did Spikes. They fired right together, and the blast killed 5 of the enemy. The other 2 crawled away, leaving blood trails. Another skirmisher closed in from the left, spraying the ground between them with automatic pistol. Kirby had his M79 crooked in his arm. He had just taken another bullet through the right wrist and was feeling the wound. The skirmisher came on and looked through the grass straight at them. Spikes fired his M79. The range was so short that the grenade didn't arm, but the sheer velocity, it blew the man's head off. Had it armed, it would have likely killed both Spikes and Kirby. A second VC closed in from the left, only to turn his back as he almost stumbled over them. Kirby killed him at a range of 5 feet. Together, 2 more groups closed in on them from the right and left. Kirby took 2 hand grenades from Speranza, who by now was wholly down, and throwing them in both directions with his wounded arm, he drove them off. He had no impression of how many he had killed or whether he had even scored a hit. He simply knew that they had faded back, easing the immediate pressure momentarily. While this deadly hide-and-seek game went on downslope, Hereford LZ was being pounded by 105 and 155 millimeter howitzers from the valley bases. Colonel Beard had called for it from his perch aloft, and still earlier when Warren asked for it. Whether it might have been brought in sooner and done any good is an open question. There was no right moment for its use until the Americans had cleared away, which movement could only be guessed at. Now it had come, and the perimeter was being cratered. One of the effects was to drive more of the enemy to the grass field lower down, where Kirby and his mates crouched. The game was still on. From downslope, a machine gun opened fire and scythed the grass beside them. Kirby went flat in the nick of time, and the bullets zinged directly over his head. Spikes didn't make it. One burst caught him in the head. The sound was enough. Kirby, 2 feet from him, didn't have to look to know he was dead. And he did not wish to look. Kirby crawled downslope about 10 feet, now looking for a weapon, thinking that the enemy might have dropped one. No luck. He was wholly out of ammunition and had no arm left but a flare pistol. So he lay flat on his back, wondering what to do. Another skirmisher came up, parted the grass, and looked directly down on him. Kirby rolled over on his side in the same motion, fired his flare pistol upward. The round smashed into the glaring face not 3 feet above him, getting him right between the eyes. The body was spun completely over by the blast, with the figure kicking. Kirby did not wait to see more than that. He crawled back the way he had come to get Speranza. The impulse was that if he had to die, he would rather not be alone. Both men were silent now. There was nothing to say. Time had about run out. They thought they were the only survivors, though this they were slightly wrong. Johnson was still face down in his private cleft. Spec 4 Charles Stuckey, whose swift reaction had started the fight, had moved obliquely to the others in getting away from the perimeter. Hidden in the tall grass alongside the knob, he had rare fortune until the final minutes. He came under a grenade shower, the last of the survivors to get hit. Directly towards Kirby and Speranza, another enemy group moved down the slope. Kirby didn't wait for them. Having nothing to fire, he crawled upward through the elephant grass, leaving Speranza and passing the skirmishers undetected. They fairly stumbled across Speranza. He played dead, his head being gory from a bullet that had entered his left ear and emerged through his nose. It is less remarkable that the deception worked than that he stayed conscious and was capable of thought. They rolled him over, searched his pockets, took his wallet, knife, and cigarettes, and continued on. Having gone inert, Speranza stayed that way. Kirby had no sense of the barraging of Hereford. Though the fire had been going on all of 10 minutes, now as he crawled upward, he at last heard the explosions and knew what they were. That determined him. He would crawl to the fire and try and hug it. Two thoughts were in his mind. Charlie will get as far away from this as possible, and if he had to die, that was still the preferable risk. Halfway back to the perimeter, his ear told him that the shelling had suddenly ceased. Not knowing what that meant, he still crawled on. It was a tortured, most labored movement. As his last reserve of will and strength was draining away, he got within 6 feet of the first foxhole before he looked up. What he saw almost numbed his senses, and he felt as if he would faint. Sitting in the foxhole, pointing an M16 directly at his head, was PFC Morgan of 1st Platoon. He crawled a few more feet forward, still prone, looked around. Every hole at Hereford was occupied by an American. Captain Warren and the company had returned to the hill. Sergeant Owen L. Lewis and James W. Edwards came over to help Kirby to his feet. No words passed between them. They were not merely choked up. They were sobbing convulsively. And seeing them, Kirby knew tears for the first time that day. Later, Warren said, "If my men cried, it was because they were so damn mad." Kirby knew better than that. They were mourning the death of the platoon. Kirby told them where to look for Speranza, not knowing that the company had found him on the way up or that he had already been evacuated from Hereford by the chopper. Stuckey appeared about that moment, and he and Kirby were flown to Ankh aboard the same Huey. It was some time later that Johnson came in. When the hill went quiet, he started crawling upward. Coming to the tall grass, he saw his friend, Sergeant Wallace W. Hood, standing in the clear on the forward edge of Hereford, and that sight brought him to his feet. Days later, he was still in a state of shock. Kirby, taken to the hospital of his own choice, returned to the company duty. Within 10 days, still convalescent. Unlike Johnson, he was fully coherent, with his emotions under tight control, till he spoke of seeing the company in tears. Warren and the company had made that frantic uphill climb to Hereford in exactly 35 minutes. The descent over the same trail had taken them an hour longer. If a record march, it was to little avail. They saw dead Americans in all but 6 foxholes and thought at first Speranza was the only survivor. The platoon weapons had been taken. Everybody had been stripped of personal effects. Warren deployed 2 of his platoons for a 600-yard sweep to the eastward along both flanks of the ridge. The hunt proved almost barren of result. Though blood trails were numerous and heavily marked, only 5 bodies were found, and they all too obviously had been felled by artillery. The fanatics must have hauled away a larger count of dead than was lost to the company. So in the end, they departed as they had come, more suddenly than mysteriously. How the trap had been sprung was easy enough to figure out in retrospect. This enemy force of about 200 was much too fresh to have followed in along Warren's wake as he came over the trail from Hill 766. The time interval was not long enough to have permitted ascent from lower levels toward which Warren had kept moving. If there had been an assembly and movement, still no sound had been detected. Last, the enemy's main weapons were sighted dead on target. Thus, the enemy force must have been there all the time, some yards off the trail and along the ridge sides as Warren's column had walked through. Had Warren stayed in full strength on Hereford, there might have been no fight. He carried out his orders. Of that came the most melancholy episode in Operation Crazy Horse. Now, you may have noticed that I didn't mention the author of this book that I'm reading. Yeah. And the reason I didn't mention the author of this book is because I didn't want to cloud your impression. The author was a guy by the name of S.L.A. Marshall. And I talked about him on podcast 142, where we covered his book, Men Against Fire, and you heard him use that phrase in here. And S.L.A. Marshall was a famous military man, we'll say. And he ended up being a general. He was a historian. He was a writer. He was a reservist, so he was a civilian writer and wrote a bunch of articles and worked for a newspaper. But he's also a very controversial figure. And Hackworth did a tour with him in Vietnam and kind of reveals the guy's character. He was very egotistical, and he also made claims about his experiences in war that were not true. He lied about his experience. You know, he lied about his military, about his combat experience in World War I. And then he also wrote in a way that supported his own theories and his own hypotheses. And in Men Against Fire, there's a lot of people that went back and broke down what he wrote in that book. And we covered that book on this podcast, like I said, because we didn't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater. But there's a lot of things that were very controversial and some of them just straight up wrong. And on top of all that, he never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So when I read this portion of Battles in the Monsoon, this was on my mind. And the article, this book didn't paint Kirby in such a bad light as the manual did, which made him just sound like a complete, lackadaisical guy that just let all this stuff go and didn't have any discipline and didn't follow any good protocols. But at the same time, I'm reading this book thinking, well, S.L.A. Marshall, he's not necessarily a guy that's he just wants a really good story. So he's not, in my opinion, and just based on the things he's written in the past, this isn't a reliable source either. Even though he would go and interview people, like those quotes he's getting, he would interview people, absolutely. But still, he's gonna make that story kind of the way he wants it. And so I was still not satisfied with the information that I had in front of me. And so I did some more research, and I found another article. I found an article on a website called historynet.com. And there's an article written by a guy named Michael Christie. So Michael Christie enlisted in the Marine Corps out of high school. And then he joined the Army. Yeah, became an officer, probably went to college, became an officer, served in the 5th Special Forces Group in Vietnam from 1967 to 1968. And in 1970, he was the commander